This morning, we're going to turn our attention to issues involving UAV use in warfare and domestic policing. And we're going to concentrate on UAVs used by the military, the CIA, and domestic security agencies. And we're going to look at sets of issues that come from assemblage of fields. One of the interesting things about our gathering is that how we've been able to bring together people working in so many different fields and to generate some productive cross-disciplinary conversations. And even within fields that might be more deriving from traditional humanities disciplines, there's even quite a bit of crossover when we confront these issues. And so our panelists today, this morning, are coming from fields ranging from film studies, media studies, cultural studies, media theory, and intersecting with science and technology studies, and feminist science studies as well. So the viewpoints coming this morning will be sort of coming from this assemblage of fields. And the way that I've structured the panel today is that we're focusing on three overlapping areas: drone subjectivities, mediations, and perspectives. They're all not distinct things, but it provides us a little bit of an organizing rubric for our proceedings today. And in the area of mediations, we're going to think about how we account for the images that we see involving scenes of UAV activity, whether these might be strikes, demos, protests, so on. In the area of subjectivities, we'll think about how we can understand the new types of subjectivities constituted in the practices of UAV operators, pilots, intelligence analysts, and commanders. And in the area of perspectives, we'll think about how we can understand historically and analytically the area orientations that come from UAVs. So just to go into these areas a little bit, really again, all of which are really on overlapping. And most of what we know about UAVs comes from the media, and it's important always to emphasize the extent to which the global media is not neutral. When we see a news report about a drone strike, we have to think about how we can cut through to the truth of the matter. And it's a matter of understanding how scenes of UAV activity take place not only on the ground, but through the construction and use of various kinds of representations. So we can think about how these views are constituted, especially in their global circulation, and especially as they come in strange new hybrids. How do we think about these representations as hybrids of something like military monitoring, scientific observation, commercial entertainment, and public broadcasting? And the subjectivity is also something that we can't really take for granted. It's constructed, at least in part, through various kinds of practices. And to probe into these practices, we can look at management strategies, ways of optimizing human productivity to meet the demands of the warfare economy, and the ways that these strategies are embedded in the specific technologies themselves. What effect does remote sensing, piloting, and targeting, the remote sensing and piloting and targeting that UAV allows, have on the subjectivities of their operators, as these technological economies redistribute and restructure the agency of operation? A really interesting question. And aerial views, as with all technologies of perspective, involve sets of techniques used to reorder vision and the positionality of the subject-object world. They have a long history, of course, of which the military has played a very prominent role. In the case of aerial views, then it's a matter of understanding the politics of their construction and use, in their capacity to function as apparatuses of control. And against this horizon, a term like air power takes on a specific historical meaning. So how, in decoding its aerial aesthetics, can we understand how air power is practiced in the era of what we might call homeland security, especially in the context of the increasing use of drones in domestic space? So we're very pleased to have our panelists today to tackle these sets of issues, and I'll introduce them in the order of their appearance. Lisa Parks is currently finishing a book called Coverage, Media Space, and Security After 9/11. And as with her earlier book, Cultures in Orbit, Satellites in the Televisual, she focuses on vertical fields of mediation. And here she examines different constellations of aerial and satellite images, media, in relation to the war on terror. She's written on aerial and satellite imaging of the wars in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and currently working on Pakistan. And she's professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Peter Asaro is a media theorist whose work examines the interfaces between social relations, human minds and bodies, and digital media. His current project focuses on the social, cultural, political, legal, and ethical dimensions of military robotics and UAVs from a perspective that combines media theory with science and technology studies. He's currently working on a book that interrogates the intersections between military technology, interface design practices, and video game culture. Karen Kaplan is professor of American Studies at UC Davis. She's the author of Questions of Travel, Postmodern Discourses of Displacement, co-author and co-editor of several books on women's studies, and the author of 2 digital multimedia scholarly works, Dead Reckoning, Aerial Perception and the Social Construction of Targets, and Precision Targets, GPS and the Militarization of Consumer Identity. Her current research focuses on aerial views and militarized visual culture. So we'll begin with the presentations, and then we'll actually wait until everyone's finished and have our panelists up on the table and have some discussion. So, Lisa?
Thank you, Jordan, very much, and thanks to Ricardo and Sheldon and all the organizers for inviting me. And it's been a great conversation the last day, and I'm excited to continue the conversation today. I'm presenting the last chapter of the book that I'm trying to finish, and it's a really condensed version of the last chapter, so there are big chunks of it that I've had to cut out. But I welcome feedback and suggestions at the end. Okay. This, we are told, is the cockpit of the future. Computer terminals used by U.S. military personnel in Nevada to operate Predator drones 7,000 miles away. Drone warfare is often imagined from such positions of computer simulation, networked communication, and remote control. And writers ranging from Paul Virilio to P.W. Singer have commented upon the button-pushing interactivities and joystick robotics that define them. While critical analyses of these practices is crucial, there's often such a fascination with the game-like dimensions of drone warfare that there's a tendency to neglect what happens beneath the belly of the drone. This chapter explores what happens when a drone war orchestrated by remote pilots kills hundreds of civilians in an area where few journalists are there to witness. Since 2004, the CIA has conducted a secret drone war in the Fatah region of Pakistan, a contentious and hard-to-access rural region on the border of Afghanistan that is inhabited by Pashtun tribes, controlled by the Taliban, used by al-Qaeda operators, and occupied by the Pakistani military. The Fatah region is extremely difficult for international journalists and relief workers to access, and locals have been punished simply for carrying cameras there. Despite the fact that the drone war in Pakistan has been conducted as a covert operation in a difficult-to-access region, information about it abounds on the internet. News organizations and citizen journalists have published reports about it, photographers have taken risks to document it, and activists worldwide have protested it. Since 2009, there has been a veritable flourishing of drone media. Drone attack scene and protest photographs, television news segments, maps, data visualizations, and commentaries representing a war that the U.S. still refuses to officially acknowledge. This situation not only raises questions about whether covert operations can be orchestrated in the age of the internet, but also provides an opportunity to evaluate the political potentials of networked media. The power of the internet to circulate drone media is especially significant given that the U.S. has waged undeclared war in the sovereign territory of an ally, killed thousands of people, and violated international law in the process. This set of circumstances, yet another U.S. state of exception, demands new ways of thinking about the power of images and networks and imagining how transnational opposition to such state actions can be catalyzed and organized. To develop my analysis, I draw upon the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri and Tiziana Terranova, who offer provocative theoretical models for considering the biopolitical functions of images and networks in the context of globalization, the information economy, and the war on terror, yet do not examine specific images or networks in their own work. Networked images not only transmit information, their dynamism, that is, their digital format, storage, and capacity for movement, reuse, and sharing, means that they have the power to affect and infect political consciousness, thought, and feeling in multifarious ways. Terranova goes so far as to describe networked images as bioweapons, writing, quote, "It is no longer a matter of illusion or deception, but of the tactical and strategic deployment of the power of affection of images. It is no longer a matter of truth and appearance, but of images as bioweapons let loose into the information ecology with a mission to infect. Indeed, it is largely through the internet that citizens have managed to collaboratively piece together the details of the drone war in Pakistan and organize modes of opposition to it. If, as Hart and Negri suggests, the internet is key to enabling a social movement to communicate and recognize a common, then we might consider how the network distribution of drone media has helped to generate a multitude, what they call a multitude, opposed to U.S. targeted killings. This chapter begins with a contextual discussion of the U.S. drone war in Pakistan, highlighting its endorsements from mainstream U.S. media, logistical challenges, legal controversies, and casualty counts. I then move to a discussion of several examples of drone media, including drone attack scene photos, aerial assault videos, and protest media that have circulated on the internet. I argue that these media, one, draw attention to a vertical field of biopower, a ground-to-air domain of life, labor, histories, technologies, and mediation that is increasingly integrated within the flows of network culture. Two, expose the logics of speculation and uncertainty that underpin drone warfare. And three, make legible a new class of the disenfranchised that we might call the targeted, people who are the intentional or incidental victims of aerial violence. And for the purpose of time, I'm skipping the entire context section because I'm assuming most of you are aware of the news reporting about the drone war in Pakistan. But I do want to, especially in light of yesterday's discussion, indicate the specific numbers of casualties from the U.S. drone war in Pakistan. And these are estimates based on data and evidence that has been gathered by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in the UK. And you can also go to their website and see that they're not only gathering statistics for what's going on in Pakistan, but they're also starting to count targeted deaths and injuries from targeted killings in Yemen and Somalia as well. So I'm going to kind of skip and just really focus on some of this media and try to do an analysis of that rather than do all the context. And this first section then focuses on drone media as making this targeted class legible and intelligible. In August 2011, a Google image search turned up hundreds of drone attack and protest scene photos scattered across an array of websites hosted on servers in locations ranging from Munich to Mountain View, from Hong Kong to Pretoria, from Turkey to Ukraine. And I've gathered many of them in an effort to think through the grounded dimensions of drone warfare and the political potentials of networked images. Building on the work of Ray Chow, Karen Kaplan, and Derek Gregory, I'm also interested in exploring how the permissible scope of the target has been widened in the context of the war on terror, leading to a displacement of the concept of the civilian in ways that also disclose the biopolitical project that has become central to the war on terror. So drone attack maps and photos, I want to suggest, bring this more extensive targeting into relief and enable us to recognize the emergence of a targeted class. What I'm also doing, which I don't really have time to talk about, is I'm trying to get really specific about where this image data is situated on the internet. So I'm working with a graduate student in film and media studies who's here, Abby Hensman, as well as a computer science graduate student on my campus, to generate a database and then to try to map where all of this drone media is on the internet to get a sense of how it's circulating and where it's, how it's part of a network infrastructure and a system of circulation. So these are just early prototypes for that. Photographs of drone attack scenes fall into three categories. The first features survivors and or bystanders standing amongst and picking through rubble. An uncaptioned AFP photo, Getty photo from February 2011, published on the Raw Story blog, features men standing next to a building in ruins destroyed in a U.S. drone attack. The roof of the building has been blown away and turned into a pile of rubble, and the rebar that once held it in place is curved down toward the ground. Another from June 2005, shot by Tariq Mahmoud, featured on CNN's website with the caption, "Drone strikes are unpopular in the region because of the threat to civilians." This photo features 3 men and a child picking through rubble, picking through a pile of rubble above which 2 giant wooden crossbeams have fallen. And there are a lot of others I don't have time to discuss. I'm just giving you a kind of sliver of each in these categories. But these photos of rubble emphasize the materialities of drone warfare, foregrounding the thick accumulations, the blockages, the grounded messes that are the vivid counterparts to the drone's orderly cockpits and aerial viewfinders. The photos of rubble also serve as a bold reminder that drone warfare is fundamentally about an attempt to control the surface of the earth, to reshape and reform the material world. The second type of drone attack photos portrays funeral processions or gatherings to honor the dead. A Reuters photo, as you see here, taken in February 2009, which appeared on England's Channel 4 website, is described as a drone funeral and features 6 caskets with white flags implanted in them as a crowd of over 100 Pakistani tribesmen, as they're described in the caption, stands in the distance to, quote, offer funeral prayers for the 27 victims of a missile strike in Miranshah. A photo that appeared in the Christian Science Monitor in June 2011 features 4 caskets perched on platforms in a rural location as about 100 Pakistani villagers offer funeral prayers for others killed in a drone strike. Since most Muslim funerals occur within 24 hours of death, these photos capture hurried efforts to honor drone victims. On some occasions, funerals in cemeteries themselves have become drone targets, and this actually came up in our conversation yesterday. This 2006 photo taken by a Predator and later provided to NBC allegedly shows a group of almost 200 Taliban insurgents at a cemetery in Afghanistan. U.S. military officers apparently wanted to attack targets within this group, but claimed to have held off because the rules of engagement prohibit attacks on cemeteries. In 2009, however, a U.S. drone attack on a funeral procession in the Makin district of South Waziristan killed at least 60 people and left many others injured. Funerals and other public gatherings, including weddings, have been singled out for so-called signature strikes, which target groups of men believed to be associated with terrorists, but whose identities are not always known. The third category of drone attack photos communicates the damage drones do to the flesh, representing dead or injured bodies. These photos have been shot either at an attack scene, a hospital, or a funeral, and are at times used in a sensationalistic manner, often featuring children. One such image that is circulated on multiple websites comes from the South Asian News Agency and shows the faces of 3 dead children as a triptych. One's head is bandaged, another has part of his skull missing, and the third is charred and covered in dried blood. This photo's caption asks, quote, "Who will avenge the blood of these Pakistanis?" and indicates that these, quote, innocent children were, quote, murdered by American drones in an attack on Danda DARPA Kel that killed 12 people. Other photos in this category, there are many, I'm not showing you all of them, I'm just giving a sample, feature survivors wearing bandages, casts, or prosthetics, emphasizing the long-term effects that the drone war has upon Pakistanis. A photo of 19-year-old Sadullah Wazir is accompanied by a caption that indicates he was 15 when he lost both of his legs and an eye in a drone attack that destroyed his home and killed 9 people. While these photos document the fatal effects of the U.S. drone attacks, it's important to remember that not all victims' bodies can be found and represented. Some drone attacks are so devastating that human bodies are unrecognizable when survivors arrive on the scene. In such cases, the explosive force of drone attacks further compounds the challenge of counting and accounting for casualties, whether militants or civilians. So distressed by the U.S. drone attacks in his homeland, Noor Behram returned to Waziristan in 2008 after living and working abroad for several years and spent 3 years trying to photograph as many drone attack sites as possible. This is a photograph of his of a drone in the sky in Waziristan. In some cases, I'll just show a few other of his photos as well. In some cases, Behram arrived on scene minutes after an explosion and put his camera aside to dig through debris and search for survivors. By July 2011, he had photographed 60 different drone attack scenes in Waziristan, and photos from 27 of these scenes were featured in a London art exhibition at the Beaconsfield Gallery entitled Gaming in Waziristan during the summer of 2011. Behram's photos constitute the first publicly known comprehensive photographic record of drone attack scenes in Waziristan and have become an essential dimension of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's effort to compile evidence that can be used against the United States in legal proceedings related to the drone attacks. These are a few others of his. So what does it mean for these drone attack photos to circulate on the internet? How have they been encountered, remembered, or passed on? What affective responses do they generate? As these photos circulate online, they generate and network affective relations. As Brian Masumi explains, affect is a, quote, pre-personal intensity corresponding to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another and implying an augmentation or diminution in that body's capacity to act, end quote. Drone attack photos, I want to suggest, represent the potential to alter the experiential state of the body by supplanting remote perspectives of drone warfare with the close-up traces and grounded remains of aerial assaults. By framing life and death beneath the belly of the drone, they allow the viewer-user to imagine what it would be like to be on the receiving end, and thus have the capacity to make the grounded experience of drone warfare intelligible, vivid, even palpable, as they populate and move through the web. The effective potential of these drone attack photos is interwoven with the technical features of the internet. Each photo is embedded within a website that is hosted by a server that is situated in a particular location that is connected to the internet. As users access and or download the photo, browsers not only transform inert data into images, they energize the photo's capacities to affect. At every user interface, the drone attack photo has the potential to elicit something that is more than itself. As Jody Dean observes, quote, "The most interesting aspect of the networked image is the way that it is not simply itself, but itself plus a nugget or shadow or trace of intensity. An image is itself and more," end quote. And this something that is more than the photo itself has the potential to circulate as well, to make networks affective. While affect can be imagined and localized as part of a subjective experience, it is also fundamentally relational, and as such is immanent in the data transfers, pathways, and contact zones of networked information. Okay, the next section is I'm going to show a couple aerial assault videos. While photos of drone attack scenes visualize the receiving end of drone warfare, Defense Department videos released or leaked online represent attacks from the perspective of remote-controlled UAV cameras. Hundreds of U.S. aerial assault videos appeared on YouTube, DVids, and LiveLeak between 2001 and 2011, featuring attacks on targets in Afghanistan and Iraq, though not in Pakistan, by Apaches, C-130s, F-16s, and UAVs. Many of the videos claim to represent insurgents, terrorists, or enemies on the ground participating in alleged suspicious behavior in Iraq and Afghanistan. Voice-over communication on some of the videos reveals that this behavior, this suspicious behavior, can include such acts as carrying rod-shaped or heat-bearing objects, assembling on a rooftop or on a street, standing or digging in a field or near a roadside, riding motorcycles on desert roads, or participating in activities near a mosque. In infrared sequences, targets are represented as moving white or black blotches that signify moving bodies, or are identified as the buildings or vehicles in which these bodies seek cover. Once the targets are confirmed, those manning the aircraft drop a hellfire bomb or spray machine gun fire on the bodies below, and they disappear into fiery explosions and clouds of smoke. And I'm sure you've seen these. I think we watched some clips yesterday. While there are no leaked videos of the drone attacks in Pakistan, the videos showing the UAV attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq are instructive. I just want to show an example here. If I can get out of those. Sorry about this. Okay. So, one 16-second video entitled UAV Hits Taliban Column, which has been viewed over 100,000 times, shows the viewfinder slightly panning. I'll just show it. This has no sound. So the viewfinder slightly panning right and left, and as walking people appearing as black dots are visible. Just as the viewfinder locates and focuses on a target, a missile plunges into the area next to a building, and a dog can be seen running away from the blast. Another example designed to showcase the U.S. military's restraint is entitled Afghanistan War, Proof of the Care Taken to Not Injure Civilian UAV Aborted Attack. And I'll show you this other one as well. The second one has sound, and I want to suggest that one of the problems with the distribution of a lot of these online is that many of them don't have sound. And I think the sound is actually the most important part of trying to make sense not only of what we're seeing, but of the logics of interpretation that are taking shape amongst a network of personnel trying to make a decision in this process. So the sound in these, I think, is so crucial. And in the longer version, I talk a lot more about this.
150 off. Viper 15 in from 280. 80 approved, cleared hop, cleared hop. Echo flies around.
And one aboard.
One's aborting. So there's boarding coming.
There's individuals with a goat right next to that. I don't think they know that those people are there.
And 1-0, we have friendly individuals with a goat in the proximity. Confirm friendly individuals. Unable to identify whether they're hostile at this time with the extra individuals. They are walking with a goat in proximity. Okay, well, good on your board. Stand by. We'll wait until he's out of the danger zone and see if we can re-engage at a later stage.
Sorry about that. Yeah, he just came from the north and he's on animalism.
Red Band, go ahead for Jerome.
Trinity is holding Jagged 7-5 outside keypad 905 until you have.
Okay. It's hard to authenticate these videos as well. I mean, some of the game software, the Death from Above simulation software looks so similar to these that it's in some cases hard to authenticate them. And it's interesting that this one's released with sound, where you can hear when they're aborting the attack, but many of them are not released with sound, although some that are pretty interesting to listen to. Okay, let me go back to the... So in this video, the decision-making process is audible, and we hear a commander direct the remote pilot to wait until the friendlies have left the danger zone and try again in a later stage. Sometimes these death from above sequences are released in Defense Department press briefings or appear in cable news segments. In these contexts, the material is anchored and framed in relation to the ideological positions and strategies of the U.S. Defense Department or the commercial news media. When these videos circulate on the internet, they can be commented upon, downloaded, shared, and or recirculated. And my review of hundreds of viewer comments posted in response to aerial assault videos reveals that the videos elicit a range of responses, but there are two general tendencies. The first approaches these videos' depiction of the killing or death of living people as a source of entertainment and visual pleasure, such that these sequences function as a kind of aerial snuff. The second tendency is to use the videos to scrutinize U.S. military policies, actions, or violence so that they function as aerial exposés that question the rules of engagement or condemn specific attacks. Thus, the videos have an inherently contradictory status in that they can be used both to celebrate U.S. aerial assaults and to scrutinize and critique and protest their use. And here's a sampling. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you get a sense of this. And here's another slide that it's interesting how some of them are quite they're scrutinizing and really trying to make sense of what is happening. Somebody even refers to it as snuff film. Need some popcorn. I can watch this stuff all day. Have fun in your fucking paradise, you low-life pieces of shit. I hope the dog was okay. These are truly regrettable. I'm unhappy about them, and I wish they would never happen. Attacks on civilians committed by whoever are a disgrace, and I condemn both sides for doing. The range of responses is quite interesting to read. So these aerial assault videos make intelligible what Judith Butler calls the differential distribution of precariousness. As Butler suggests, quote, war is precisely an effort to minimize precariousness for some and to maximize it for others, end quote. Here, precariousness is registered along an axis of invisibility-visibility, where U.S. troops are invisible, even if audible, as weaponized vehicles hover above people who appear as moving dots of black or white, signaling the presence of the targeted. The levels of precariousness in these sequences are contingent upon differential access to aerial and terrestrial space, telecommunication, artillery, positioning, and vantage points. Apprehending precariousness, according to Butler, requires a shift beyond us and them and victim-perpetrator paradigms, such that these frames of war reveal precariousness for all involved. That is to say, precariousness is part of life for everyone, even for the U.S. soldiers who are shielded by weaponized aircraft or who are situated thousands of miles away. It is registered in their heavy breathing, the tension and anxiety in their voices, and even in what we do not see framed, such as the bad dreams, the nightmarish visions, and the unassimilable experiences of veterans' futures. The information contained in these videos also reveals that most aerial assaults are based on an optics of suspicion. Bombings and killings are authorized again and again because people on the ground appear to be, or look like, or are believed to be carrying objects or moving in ways that look suspicious. In other words, the most tentative kind of knowledge is met with the most fatal kind of act. The next section is on drone protest media. As the frequency and death tolls of drone attacks in Pakistan escalated in 2009 and 10, they were met with major demonstrations in Islamabad, Karachi, Peshawar, Multan, Lahore, and also in London, Dublin, and Washington, D.C. The Pakistani demonstrations have been organized by a variety of political organizations, such as Pakistan's National Trade Union Federation, the Labour Party, Foundation for Fundamental Rights, among others, and have been documented by photojournalists, news agencies, and activists alike. The drone protest photos not only reflect Pakistani citizens' widespread discontent with the Zardari administration, they also send a bold message to the Obama administration and U.S. citizens. Many of the signs and banners are written in English and include phrases such as "Down with American drones," "Stop drone attacks," "Stop killing of innocent tribal peoples, victims of drones," "Obama, hands off Muslim lands," "USA, leave us alone." Thousands of innocent civilians died of drone attacks. Who is responsible? And there are many of these in circulation online. Many of these drone protest photos were taken during the demonstrations in the spring of 2011, the notorious Arab Spring, when most of the world's attention was focused on mass demonstrations in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria. While the Arab Spring uprisings, which attempted to oust the long-standing leaders of corrupt regimes, were celebrated as showcasing democracy in action, anti-drone demonstrations in Pakistan were largely ignored by the Western mainstream media, despite the fact that Pakistanis, too, are fighting a corrupt regime. Indeed, Pakistani citizens find themselves between a rock and a hard place as their own government has authorized U.S. drone attacks, resulting in the killings of hundreds of civilians and injury of untold others. And news is happening about this as we sit here, where a couple weeks ago, Pakistan forbade these attacks from continuing, although the U.S. is not, the CIA is still continuing with its program. The particularities of the political situation in Pakistan, of which I've barely scratched the surface, makes the internet circulation of drone attack and protest photos all the more significant, for they carry and transmit Pakistanis' urgent objections to the drone war across nation-state borders and within the informational milieu. As we have witnessed in other countries in recent years, this capacity has become a crucial tactic in political movements against oppressive regimes, though it can also lead to a situation in the world in which the world knowingly watches on as state-sanctioned violence against civilians persists, as we've seen in Syria in recent months. In her book, Digital Media and Democracy, Megan Bowler argues that the current historical conjuncture defined by the War on Terror is characterized on the one hand by, quote, a radical democratization of knowledge and multiplication of sources and voices afforded by digital media, and on the other, by blatant outrageous instances of falsified national intelligence shielded from scrutiny. She continues, quote, because much footage is accessible in digital form, whether through official news sites or individuals posting footage, we have a new way of constructing accounts to assuage our sense of having been lied to, but having very few ways to prove it, end quote. It is precisely the sense of having been lied to that led India-based YouTube user Sandeep SB1 to produce a 56-second video Death by Drone in the Still of the Night, posted on January 28, 2011. The video draws upon a repertoire of images found online to construct a fictional romance between a drone operator and a person on the ground. I'm just going to show you that clip real quick. Am I doing okay for time? I have like 2 or 3 more pages. Okay. Where did I put that? Here we go.
In the still of the night, watch me, my love, as I circle over you with caress. In the still of the night, while you sit by a fire, watch me, my love, hover over your darling face, soundless from Arizona with a joystick in my hand, soundless over you with love. And then I squeeze the red button and the Bahenchod hellfire slides out and cuts into your cross-wired face. Such is my love, such is my precision, Bahenchod love.
This air-to-ground romance is articulated through a rewriting of the 1956 doo-wop song, In the Still of the Night by the Five Satins, so that it reads, "In the still of the night, watch me, my love, as I circle over you with caress. In the still of the night, while you sit by your fire, watch me, my love, hover over your darling face from Arizona with the joystick in my hand, soundless over you with love. And then I squeeze the red button and the hellfire slides out and cuts into your cross-wired face. Such is my love, such is my precision." The visual track opens with scenes of drones floating harmlessly through the sky, and after a round of gunfire is heard, a more cataclysmic vision appears. A massive hellfire explosion is followed by a series of photographs of drone attack victims' funerals and dead bodies. The sequence closes with a photo of Barack Obama with the words, "Yes, we can," inscribed upon it. While the networked drone attack and protest photos use conventions of realism to generate and extend political affection, this video functions in a highly self-conscious manner, using the saccharine spirit of the American pop song and the subversive sensibilities of mashup to architect its romantic nightmare. In what feels like a happenstance homage to Hiroshima Mon Amour and La Jetée, the video confronts the psychic dimensions of drone warfare by casting the targeter and the targeted in an uncanny love that is orchestrated as a fatal air-to-ground affair. Here, drone attack scene photos become a kind of raw material for building networked antagonisms and responses to state strategies of secrecy, silence, and denial. Since the Pakistani government has authorized U.S. drone attacks in the Fatah region, using its sovereign power against its own people, and since the U.S. continues to engage in targeted killings, there is a need for spaces and forms of political organization that exceed their authority. Hart and Negri envision the Internet both as a metaphor for and infrastructure of this kind of transnational, anti-sovereign political organization. And while some have critiqued Hart and Negri's concept of the multitude for its idealism, it remains useful by challenging us to consider where resistance to U.S. drone attacks in Pakistan comes from, how it is mobilized and multiplied, and how it can make a difference in the war on terror. Drone media can be understood as making parts of the multitude legible, highlighting its various locations, scattered constituencies, array of positions, and mixture of biological and technological forms. The Internet has linked Pakistani demonstrators with American activists John Hyde and Gretchen Nielsen, who were arrested after they unfurled a banner declaring, "War is not a show," as they quietly stood near the Predator on display at Davis Monthan Air Force Base in March 2010. It connects Pakistani demonstrators with Peace of Action members who marched to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia in January 2010 to protest the U.S. drone program, and with the so-called Creech 14, who were found guilty of trespassing during an April 2009 protest at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. It networks survivors' families in Waziristan with protesters at General Atomics Predator manufacturing plant in San Diego, and with the 200 Americans who swarmed the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. in October 2011 to protest a drone exhibit and were forced out of the museum and covered with pepper spray. And to those who gathered late last month, including, I think, Peter, we were at the Drone Summit last month in Washington, D.C. As Hart and Negri insist, the constitution of the multitude is based on the constant legitimate possibility of disobedience, end quote. Now I just have a short conclusion. As drone media have helped to catalyze and make legible a multitude opposed to targeted killings, they have also served three other functions. First, drone media have drawn attention to vertical fields of biopower. Since drone warfare is here to stay and is likely to be deployed more frequently and suddenly, for instance, in recent months, U.S. drone attacks have killed over 160 people and injured dozens in Somalia and also in Yemen. Because of this, it's vital that vertical fields of biopower continue to be critically delineated and analyzed. This analysis needs to extend beyond Virilio's important recognition of the technological fusion of the airplane, the camera, and the gun, to include more careful consideration of the biopolitical organization of resources, such as fuel, land, labor, hardware, networks, data, sky, orbit, and the hierarchies of command that enable targeted killings and the aerial restructuring of life on Earth. Just as it's important to recognize how drone warfare is defined by remote control, simulation, and gaming, it's equally important to acknowledge its grounded dimensions, the landscapes and topographies that register and archive the drone's uses and effects. During the past century, the world has witnessed a devastating flurry of air raids, carpet bombings, and surgical strikes. That the drone is now being heralded by some as a technology of humane warfare is not only deeply troubling, but perverse. Second, as drone use supplements the dark side of the war on terror, the profiling, the capturing, transporting, detention, and torturing of terror suspects with practices of targeted killing, it has generated a new disenfranchised class of targeted people. Particular inhabitants of Pakistan, Somalia, and the occupied territories, for instance, have become part of a disenfranchised, targeted class simply because they live in areas in which terror suspects may operate. In such areas, anyone and everyone is at risk, and daily life is haunted by the specter of aerial bombardment. Drones may sidestep the dirty work of torture, but they advance other kind of psyops, using the sky to delineate and administer zones of surveillance and fear, death, and destruction. As zone media visualize the targeted, whether in a drone attack photo or an aerial assault video, they reveal that asymmetric warfare creates new forms of disenfranchisement for some and greater precariousness for all. Though drones are currently controlled by aero-orbital elites, they are likely to be used by a wider array of political entities in the near future, given their relatively low cost and ease to develop. Witness, for instance, the emergence of DIY drone websites or the homemade drone used to monitor police at an Occupy protest in Warsaw, Poland in November 2011, or the fact that online hobby stores are sold out of most drone models. While the targeted may appear to be isolated to certain lawless regions or rogue states, the expansion of drone use, including by local law enforcers from New York to Houston, on the U.S.-Mexico border, and against U.S. citizens in the case of Anwar Awlaki and his 16-year-old son in Yemen. Given these situations, it reveals that people across the planet, including citizens of democratic nation states, are becoming part of a targeted class. Finally, as drone media expose vertical fields of biopower and new forms of disenfranchisement, they also reveal that decisions to kill from the air are often based upon logics of suspicion, speculation, and uncertainty. Drone pilots make decisions to strike targets based on close readings of distant views, and after conversations with parties situated within and beyond the designated mission area. Although targets are typically confirmed by intelligence on the ground, it is often difficult for remote decision makers to differentiate enemies from friendlies and to discern a weapon from a piece of farming equipment or to distinguish a boy from a man. And there have been numerous civilian casualties and injuries resulting from such confusions. A video parody called The Ethical Governor resolves such errors by forecasting a future that removes the human element from drone warfare, delegating all decision-making to the drone itself. In these futurist scenarios, drones select and destroy targets using a decision matrix, intervene only according to the rules of engagement, and assess guilt levels after an attack, deactivating weapon systems if the drone has killed too many people. What this parodic commentary suggests is the need to investigate further the perceptual dimensions of drone warfare, to explore and evaluate how remote pilots see, what they know, and when they strike. Even though drones are automated systems, the aerial views they acquire and the bombs they drop are received by humans at both ends. And because of this, we cannot afford not to respond to and deliberate this new form of warfare. And drone media help us to do just that. Thank you. Get out of your way here. There we go. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a very good setup for what I'm going to talk about, which is really looking at the subjectivities of drone operators. And I want to just kind of start by contextualizing it a little bit in terms of my project, what I've been working on, and how this fits into that larger project. So for a number of years, more than a decade now, I've been looking at robotics in many dimensions and really trying to examine them as expressions of society and culture and our philosophical views about ourselves, both within the media, and so we have these kind of film representations of RoboCop and Terminator, and what sort of cultural narratives are being expressed through those, and then more recently the introduction of the drone warfare and how we think about warfare more generally and using robots as an entree into that. And I think they're a very powerful kind of cultural metaphor insofar as they're sort of unmanned in our parlance, and that allows us a certain kind of objective distance that we stop thinking in some cases about the individual and we see this mechanical object and we think about it in a way that sort of destabilizes a lot of our assumptions and lets us think a little more critically. And we talked a little bit yesterday about the Godonkin experiment, and there's been a lot of discussion in the history of artificial intelligence and robotics about, when you think about what intelligence is, right, you can speculate a lot, but when you have to synthesize it, when you have to build something out of it, it forces you to pick a very specific model. And as we design these kinds of systems, we're constantly introducing models into them of cultural beliefs, social beliefs, ethical and legal policies and beliefs. And I also wanted to put this in a historical frame. So there's been a lot of discussion in the last decade about the age of robots. There's a Scientific American with an article by Bill Gates recently, but they're not all that new. So if you go back to the 40s and 50s, the robots have been coming for a long time. Indeed, drones are not a completely new idea at all. This is from 1934. A kind of popular mechanics journal called modern mechanics. And they actually tried to build some of these and test them. This was a British design for an attack aircraft that would follow a searchlight up to a target using photocells. And they did a lot of experimentation in the 30s on this. There were actually numerous cases in which the U.S. used drones in the military for a number of years during World War II and again during Vietnam, and then stopped using them again. So that history, I think, is significant. And I sort of got into this thinking more about interface design and the history of the interface design. What were really the technological implications and limitations and difficulties of it, building these technologies and starting by looking at the interface. And I think the interface is very interesting because it's the point of contact between the human and the machine. And there's a lot that goes on in the design of these interfaces. So these are all different UAV interfaces, and every UAV had its own interface for a long time. So that this created a lot of problems, and there's been a lot of human factors analysis, human-computer interface design, a lot of scientific knowledge, designing and planning that's gone into trying to streamline these and make them more efficient, including the use of a lot of video game visual structures, rhetorical structures, design elements. This is the Future Combat Systems demo, which was the largest research and development project ever initiated by the Pentagon. It's been canceled. Parts of it still exist. It was developed by Boeing and SAIC. And their demo, which they showed to Congress, was actually developed by a video game company. And you see some screenshots of that below that were involved in this installation. So they're really thinking and taking all these metaphors from first-person shooter games, real-time strategy games, utilizing these to develop the interfaces. And they're even using the actual video game controllers. So the Xbox and PlayStation controllers are being used quite widely now, and including now the actual cockpit for the new design of this is the universal UAV cockpit designed by Raytheon. It's utilizing these joysticks here that I showed you on the previous page, which are you can get at Amazon for a couple $100. They're modeled after the F-16 flight controls. They're very popular for flight simulator games. But what you had was a problem that the military recognized in training and in the accidents and problems caused by these complicated proprietary interfaces that I showed you before. In terms of getting people trained on them, if you switch from one to another one, it's very easy to make mistakes. The interfaces are all different. There's a lot of crashes and mishaps and things like that. And they found by just switching to video game controllers, training time went way down because most of the soldiers have a lot of experience using Xbox controllers and PlayStation controllers. And they're also very cheap, widely available, ready-made. So the worry then, of course, is we're turning war into a video game. I'll talk about that in a bit more. And Lisa did a very good job of kind of setting up these two kind of master narratives, or I call them mythologies, regarding this kind of warfare. And the first I call the heroic myth, right? And she did a good job explaining the context in which certain images and videos have been released of predator footage that shows this is the Taliban funeral. And this was released in the context of a debate about following the laws of war. That actually somebody really wanted to fire on this group of Taliban, but they were told they couldn't, right? So there was an imposition of ethics. And so the use of these kinds of images and the rhetoric around them is that they are making us more ethical in our choices of targets. Or making the operators more ethical in their choice of targets, right? And then there's this counter-narrative to that, which is the anti-heroic myth, that this is going to turn people into these PlayStation warriors, push-button war, and the sort of the most powerful rhetorical video in this context was the Collateral Murder WikiLeaks video, which is actually an Apache helicopter footage that was re-edited to show what were considered to be war crimes. By the editors in WikiLeaks. So we have this sort of debate, like, are these things making us more ethical? Are they turning us into these callous, cold-blooded video game warriors? But to really understand that, or to really critically evaluate that in any way, I think we need to really understand the subjectivity of the operators. What is their experience of war like? What is their experience of operating and choosing targets and deciding to use lethal force. And it's a very complicated situation. So I sort of set out to try to figure out, well, what is that subjectivity? How would we find out what that subjectivity is? And as Jordan's performance last night illustrated quite well, it's incredibly complicated. There's many layers of organization, of individuals, of technologies, and very complicated technologies, each of which has its own history and has come together in manifold different ways. But just to focus in on one aspect of that and try to deconstruct it and critically analyze it a little bit, and looking at the ground control station, where is it the context in which these operators are actually working, and how do they do their work? And of course, I would love to do a long-term ethnography and watch drone operators doing their jobs for hours on end for several months, analyze all the data, or have grad students do all that. But it's very hard to get that kind of access. And so instead, what I've tried to do in this paper, which is going to be an article in Social Semiotics on surveillance and labor, was the topic I was invited to write a paper for. So I was like, well, I can't get this direct ethnographic data, but I really want to try to understand this subjectivity. So I'm going to use the available resources that I have, which are texts that have been written about these subjective experiences. And there's two sources that I'm mainly focusing on. One is a series of 3 reports that have been issued, one by the NATO and 2 by the Pentagon, on UAV operator burnout and the sort of psychological stress that UAV operators have experienced. Because anecdotally, I've heard a number of people say that UAV pilots actually experience higher levels of post-traumatic stress disorder than other forms of combat personnel, but I haven't been able to find any actual data, right? And I'm sure there are some classified reports within the military, and maybe some people who know this literature better than me can help point me to that if it's not classified. But I'm really trying to analyze the rhetoric and the scientific knowledge that exists within those, and those are all framed within the history of organizational psychology and human resources sciences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the other piece of data that I was using was portions of Omar Fast's 5,000 Feet or Best, which includes this documentary interview with a UAV pilot who describes very vividly in a first-person account what his experience of being a drone pilot and operator was. So I'm going to show a brief clip of that segment again later. So ultimately, I'm really kind of trying to figure out, well, what, when you sit in this cockpit, what is your experience? What kinds of sources of information? How do you evaluate those pieces of information? How does that technology situate you as a subject and situate your experience and understanding as a subject? And this is the kind of cockpit that they're looking at. I just want to draw your attention to the lower right screen, where they're often conducting numerous chats and things like that. And they also have this aviation control. So there's actually 3 people who are considered drone operators for a Predator or Reaper drone. And you have a pilot, and the pilot is an officer, and the pilot is the commander of the vehicle. But the pilot in general does not actually have the authority on his own or her own to make a targeting decision. They actually have to request permission from a superior officer in order to fire. Sitting next to them, so this is the kind of display that they would look at. This is actually from a Global Hawk. But they have their sort of avionics, their map, other kinds of information. This is an actual Predator cockpit. And so you'd have the pilot in one chair, and then the other chair you have the sensor operator who's operating the cameras on the dome that lie below it, on the belly of the Predator. And they both have joysticks because you have to steer the camera system around. So within the analysis of the stress levels of these UAV pilots, they quite conveniently, and this is meant more as an image, don't have to read all of that. This is the list of tasks that a pilot is expected to do. And it's a very long list, and it's a very complicated list. In general, they consider the ratio of how much time it takes to operate the aircraft versus how much time it takes to conduct mission operations. And in traditional aircraft, you spend about 80% of your time keeping like a fighter jet or a bomber. You spend about 80% of your time managing the aircraft itself and about 20% of your time executing mission operations. With the UAV, they've inverted that. So a pilot of a UAV spends about 20% of his time maintaining the aircraft in flight and in its direction, and then the other 80% conducting these mission operations, which can be quite elaborate in terms of controlling the aircraft. And then they're also managing the surveillance operations, although most of that task falls onto the sensor operator. And most of the sensor operators came from a background in imagery analysis, where they would be given an image, they have to determine the contents of it, articulate that, express that to the people who requested information. Actually, in the context of the Predator, the sensor operator has an incredibly complicated job. They're actually also in charge of the targeting and control and release of the weapons system. They have to be ordered to do so by the pilot, and the pilot will be an officer. The sensor operator is an enlisted personnel, so they're of lower rank. But they're actually guiding and targeting the missile itself. And there's an incredible amount of labor that goes into this. And if we think back to the history of labor management and Taylorism and this kind of detailed breakdown of what people do, and we saw a bit of the kind of research yesterday in terms of just 3D navigation, and the complexity of that task, and the kind of psychological research that can go into designing a good interface. Multitasking is another huge problem, and this is also from one of these human resources analysis stress. And they've identified this many years ago, that unlike traditional pilots who aren't asked to do nearly as much, they fly the plane and then they only have this sort of 20% of mission operations. And mostly they'll do some visual identification, but they're not asked to do a lot, whereas a pilot of a drone has to do a lot of cognitive analysis of the kinds of information. And they're getting not just visual information and some radio information. An F-16 pilot doesn't have to read a screen or maintain multiple chats, and actually a UAV pilot does. So there's an incredible amount of multitasking. And so in order to even get certified as a pilot, you actually have to go through a separate set of tests that test your ability to multitask and hand-eye coordination tasks while conducting communication tasks over a radio comm link. And then they have a third personnel member who's a member of this crew who's called the mission, I'm going to mess it up, the mission operations officer, command communications officer, whose actually sole job is to manage the flow of communications between the pilot and operator and the sort of greater field of personnel, because outside of this ground station, you have imagery and analysts who are all over the globe potentially, who are conducting analysis on the images that drone is collecting at the moment, sending back reports on that. You have a higher level administration and command structure that's telling you what to do in terms of your mission, or is deciding whether you are authorized to fire on a target, and that can include lawyers, commanding officers, intelligence personnel, all of whom, and then collating this around various databases of historical data, of what kinds of, what else has gone on in this location, what is this person perhaps suspected of doing in the past, in order to make these kinds of very complicated decisions. And so it doesn't fall easily into either the video game mythology or into the purely virtuous warrior mythology, because there's a great deal of complexity. Okay, so I want to step back for a moment and play the video. So I'm just going to show about 3 minutes from this video. And again, this is an actual Predator operator discussing his experience of conducting operations.
usually after we got done with work and then getting back home, you have about 2 hours before you have to go to sleep for work the next night. Because usually I wouldn't get home until 10 o'clock in the morning. You jump in the shower to get your breakfast, play some video games for 4 hours, and then try to sleep. A lot of guys, believe it or not, over there play video games in their free time. Guess that's their way of unwinding. Mine are a lot of role-playing games, flight simulators. I guess Predator is similar to playing a video game, but playing the same video game 4 years straight, every single day on the same level. Like one time I just watched the same house for a month straight for at least 11 hours every day for a month. But then you have your moments when there's a real emergency going on, and that's just where stress comes into play. How do I hit that truck, and in what way do I hit that truck, and how far away should I put the missile to get the truck, so that way I don't have any damage to the surrounding buildings or to the people or hurt anybody else's life that's around there. And sometimes I make mistakes. I mean, there's horror sides to working Predator. You see a lot of death. You see it all. As I said, they can tell you what type of shoes you're wearing from that far away. It's pretty clear about everything else that's happening. I mean, there came a point after 5 years of doing this that it's just I had to think about, wow, there's so much loss of life that was a direct result of me. I mean, there was a lot of personal stuff I had to go through, a lot of chaplains I had to talk to just because. And the one factor that they talked about that helped me is that if it wasn't me who was doing it, then some new kid would be doing it, but worse. I was 26 at the time. And a lot of people look like, how can you have PTSD if you weren't actively in a war zone? Well, technically speaking, every single day I was active in a war zone. I mean, I may not have been personally harmed, but I was directly affecting people's lives over there every single day. There's stress that comes with that. I mean, with having a fire, or having to see some of the death, to see what's going on, having anxiety, looking back on a certain situation or incident over and over and over, bad dreams, loss of sleep. It's not like a video game. I can't switch it off. It's always there. Just there was a lot of stress with that, and they kind of call it virtual stress.
Okay, so that's a good example of one of these kind of first-person subjective narratives. The actual analysis of burnout and stress that was conducted by the medical personnel within the military, OMA, I mentioned before in the citation. What they did was actually interview 400 operators. I'm sorry, I just have to find my slides again. Hopefully we're in the right place. Okay. So what they did was conduct interviews with 400 Predator operators and collated all of these first-person accounts. Now, they told people that it was confidential. It was strictly for research purposes. They wouldn't discuss it outside of the context of that. And what they found was much higher levels of stress and what they called burnout, and I'll come back to that in a minute, amongst the drone operators. And it's this kind of stress that you just heard. What they also found was no incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, in the military at large, there's about a 6% rate of post-traumatic stress disorder. So out of 400, they should have had, several cases at least. So it would be a statistical anomaly if there were no PTSD in that. And given that they were actually experiencing rates almost twice the normal rate for stress and what they call burnout, then we might expect to actually see higher rates of PTSD than the normal rate. As well as the other factors about the visuality of the killing that they're experiencing. So I think we have to kind of take a step back from the results of that study and ask ourselves why those results might be taking place. And I think the explanation comes, and it can also be read out of this first-person account from the Omar Fast video, which is there's actually a social stigma that's very powerful that's attached to getting a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis within the military. Because it's been medicalized and stigmatized, if you are diagnosed with PTSD, you would be taken off station. You would no longer be a pilot or sensor operator. You might be reassigned, or you might be expelled completely from the military, depending on the severity of it. And again, depending on the severity, if you re-enter civilian life, that may prohibit you from obtaining employment very effectively if you have that diagnosis, although you'd be entitled to medical care. So there's a strong incentive for people not to report their experience of post-traumatic stress, or to find other ways to manage and deal with that in ways that are non-medicalized. In the instance that we heard of the first-person account from the film, he visited a chaplain, and this is a very common strategy. You can go and discuss these kinds of things with a chaplain instead of a psychiatrist, and then it's not medicalized, and it's not stigmatized in the same way. Another strategy from the perspective of scientific organizational management and psychology is this gets recategorized as burnout, right? Which is a condition of stress that threatens the job but doesn't make your job undoable, but it allows them to give you a little bit of time off to kind of recover before going back into service. So it's a kind of workaround to giving PTSD diagnoses. But they're finding very high levels of this, of course, in this context. And then they do a much broader analysis of the sources of stress, and they contextualize this within scientific labor management. And they look at career options, which has an interesting history within, especially the Air Force piloting. So initially, a lot of the pilots of the UAVs were taking from other air platforms. So they were flying other kinds of aircraft, and then they were taken and sent to the UAV duty. And this was seen as a bad thing, career-wise, right? Especially if you're a fighter pilot, which is very prestigious within the Air Force. Now you're being asked to fly, essentially a big model airplane, right? And that's a huge, decrement to your ego, but it could also mean long-term a career dead end, or at least slowing down of your career and promotion processes, potentially. So there was a lot of uncertainty amongst those pilots who had been moved from other aircraft. Moreover, then they started training people straight into UAVs with no manned aircraft flight experience. And there was a big debate within the Air Force, which was resolved in December 2009. They decided to actually issue flight wings to the pilots of UAV drones. Prior to that, you might have wings because of your other certifications on other aircraft, but you wouldn't get one solely for flying a UAV. Now you do, and that's, again, another status within the Air Force structure. To be a pilot has a lot of status associated with it. So they're trying to represent that, although there's an insignia at the middle of the wings that indicates that it's unmanned. And similarly with sensor operators, many of whom were taken out of the traditional intelligence imagery analysis track and retrained to do this kind of job, it was a much more difficult job, right? There's many more facets to it. It's far more stressful, and it's not exactly clear where you go. So the career path for a typical imagery and analyst is to move up from smaller platforms to bigger platforms, right? So you start with the small UAVs, you work up towards the bigger UAVs and the more sophisticated kinds of radar and image analysis, up to satellites, which is the most prestigious and sophisticated kinds of imagery. But now you get stuck in a UAV, well, where do you go after that, right? There's nothing else that's really like that. And for both the pilot and the sensor operator, these jobs are really different than other historic jobs, especially in terms of their stress and the relationship between visuality and lethality. So certainly infantry soldiers experience a great deal of both, and that's a fairly common tradition. Pilots have traditionally not experienced both. Pilots in Vietnam, they called it the morality of altitude. The idea that you are flying high above all of the casualties and the horrors of war, you're dropping the bombs, you sort of have an abstract understanding of that, but you don't have that direct, visceral, visual experience of it. that is now being represented to the pilots through these video images. Snipers, to an extent, have this very long-term visual intimacy with their targets, but they're also then at a distance, which gives them a certain degree of safety. However, they're in theater. They experience the weather, they smell the smells, they can be found and killed. And so they have a very different embodied experience to that. In terms of the systematic analysis of data and analysis and identification of targets, this sorts of processes have gone on for decades within aerial bombing and targeting, and how do we decide what we're going to strike, how many pounds of bombs we're going to drop on this building, etc. But that hasn't ever happened in this feedback loop. Virilio has done a good job of accounting for how in World War I and World War II, various military commanders sought to close this cycle, this loop, to smaller and smaller and faster times, from getting images to dropping bombs to understanding what the implications, assessing the damage from that. But now we actually have this real-time cycle, and it's experienced very viscerally by these operators. So this is also causing a great deal of stress. And the displacement from the battlefield and from the theater of conflict is also itself recognized as something that's very stressful. So it shows up many times in the popular media as, they fight a war all day, and then they, go home to their wife and kids in the suburb at night, right? And this movement between these spaces of domesticity and conflict are themselves sources of stress. And I think part of that stems from the sense in which when you're in conflict theater, you have comrades who are around you experiencing that same thing with you, and you are able to express your feelings and emotions in various ways, not always verbally necessarily, but you have a shared sense of experience, and that you know that these people understand what you're going through because they're going through the same thing. But when you only experience that in the workplace, and then you go home, and your family can't relate to that, and your friends can't relate to that, and you're going back and forth between those worlds on a daily basis, I think that kind of emotional challenge is very stressful for individuals. Plus, they also have, these research reports articulate numerically, that they're also experiencing a great deal of family stress, right? So if you're off to war for several months, you might worry about the kids getting off to school, but not every day, right? It's an abstract worry, something in the back of your mind. But if you actually have to take your kids to school every day, right, and you have to deal with the emotional demands of your spouse, there's all these additional stress demands that are also placed on you. And the other aspect of this is that the demand for this kind of the drone products and what they do is in heavy demand within the military, and so they're flying these things as often and as continuously as possible. So they're in constant duty cycles. As soon as they're repaired, they're back up. They're working long shifts. There's not enough personnel to analyze the data, to fly the aircraft. So there's these compounding elements of stress that are building up in these pilots, which affect then how they experience the war and also how they make their decisions. So I think this is kind of the first portion of this research, but looking at the implications for that, for how do we try to design these kinds of systems, or how do we understand this remote method of warfare. And I think we're really just kind of in the early stages of really understanding this. So here's my Kubrickian image. Instead of the nuclear bombs, it's got the unmanned vehicle onesie. And we're really kind of creating a new kind of subjectivity, right? A new way of engaging with the world that's being shaped by the technology, but a technology which we in turn can shape. And so there are certain ethical demands on us to think about how to design that technology. But that also requires a lot more knowledge about what the subjectivities are, what kinds of subjectivities we're creating, and how we can possibly shape those with various kinds of visualities, information technologies. And I think at a fundamental level, it's about what kind of psychological and emotional connections do we want to make between these operators and the people at the other end on the ground that we saw in the last presentation. So I just want to end with that.
Sorry, borrowed computer. Yeah, thanks. It's different than mine. Oh, yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, that I got. Thanks. Hi. I want to thank Ricardo, Jordan, Sheldon, and everyone else who's worked to organize this really important and fascinating conference. I've been learning so much, and I'm really thrilled about that. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate. As I've mentioned already over the last day, I'm working on a large, very long project on aerial views. And I started my interest in this when I was looking into navigation technologies used in the first Persian Gulf War, and I was working on sort of dual-use technologies and GPS. And I've always worked on present day. And so as I started to work on the project, I thought I was working on the first Persian Gulf War, and then it turned into a second Persian Gulf War. So I thought, okay, that's those are pretty good parameters. But more and more, as I tried to figure out what was going on with views from above, I found myself having to go back further in time. So I've become kind of I'm sort of a converso, and I've turned into a historian. So the mantra for my talk today is nothing is new. And you'll forgive me if it's my own enthusiasm for encountering these histories that leads me to harp on it. So the increasing use of unmanned drones in domestic policing brings it into immediate relief some of the most pressing instantiations of the era of Homeland Security and the complex social, political, economic aspects of neoliberalism. We've been discussing many of these issues already lately at this conference in ways that deepen on my understanding and ideas about critique. But in my comments today, I want to focus on some entangled elements of the visual culture of drones that come into play in the supposedly distinct arena of the so-called domestic use. And I think I really want to trouble the term domestic, as we've been also troubling in fascinating ways the term unmanned. In so doing, I want to raise historiographic questions that shift the terms and parameters of the critique of the use of drones, recalibrating the temporal and spatial characteristics of their deployment. Because first and foremost, drones are airborne. They operate in the context of air power, one of the most powerful and enduring symbolic registers of 20th and 21st century warfare. But inasmuch as air power has undergone a series of operational crises, drones also signify the current imperative of unmanned flight, thereby deconstructing many of the more romantic legacies that we've been talking about already of manned or piloted technologies of flight. And again, to pivot in another direction, we could say that drone operations require a manning, a massive number of actors who labor to make the system of so-called unmanned observation and weaponry work properly. These conditions echo earlier support, logistics, and operational practices, but they also differ, and hence an arguably neoliberal moment. So in order to better understand these continuities and discontinuities, I'm particularly interested in two components of the doctrinal myths and histories of air power. The observational practices of topographical surveying that produce geographical knowledge, as well as forms of surveillance and reconnaissance. I won't be able to talk about that very much today, but that underlies my interest to a great degree. And also patrol, the quotidian routine forms of observation that produce regimes of biopolitical control. And I will say a little more about that. Air power in general and the technical practices of aerial topographical surveying and reconnaissance, visual patrolling, all emerged out of a colonial context in the Middle East, in general and Iraq in particular. This is a submerged history that accounts for a big chunk of the book I'm working on, which gets into why the supposed sideshows in World War I, where air power was so vitally necessary, doesn't really occupy very much space in the mythologies of aces and dogfights, etc. This is a submerged history in the accounting of modern warfare. Therefore, it's deeply embedded in the neoliberal operations of contemporary military policing practices, but it's unable to be recognized or acknowledged as such, and therefore is repeated over and over, although with a difference. The visual culture generated by the geographical continuities of air power is the subject of much of this recent work I've been doing, and I'd really be eager to talk more about it if we have time during discussion. But for now, I would just say that aerial topographical surveying and reconnaissance as routine patrolling became inculcated in governmental and commercial or industrial requirements for expansive views of property holdings, communities, and all manner of planning, urban, rural, and suburban, throughout the 1920s and into the 20th century, while simultaneously emerging as major academic enterprises in geography, archaeology, information sciences, etc. The mainstreaming of this visual culture was thoroughly accomplished by the Second World War and only remained to be refined and diversified throughout the rest of the century. As Virilio and many others have pointed out, the so-called revolution in military affairs in the late 1980s and 90s sutured these perceptual fields and micro-practices to the informational needs of the military and commerce in increasingly expanded ways through digitalization, while also offering new modes of entertainment that brought more and more subjects into the everyday pleasures of immersive viewing and management of information on personal screens. In sketching this briefest of cultural histories with rapid nods to Virilio, Derderian, Gregory, Graham, Ade, and others who are here today, I'm acknowledging that air power and its visual culture is relatively hegemonic, of a significantly long durée in modernity, and that computerization instantiated material shifts in the practices of observation that we associate with aerial viewing. I'm also, however, arguing that we should not be too quick to assume a totally new landscape, as it were, of either RMA or post-9/11 visual practices. The era of Homeland Security is certainly specific, but its most celebrated differences not only may be less new than we think, our concern with these differences as superficial generalities may obscure the opportunity to draw on the rapid emergence of drones across the spectrum of aerial policing and observation as ways to understand how war is waged in the now as well as then and in the future. In the time I have left, I want to link three modes of domestic policing from the beginning of the 20th century into the 21st: seaplanes, helicopters, and drones. I'm not making light of the differences between them, manned, unmanned, etc., and the various technologies involved in each, in drawing them together. But I would argue that telling this story about aerial domestic policing offers a different way of understanding power in its manifestly varied and uneven modes. The first reported incidents of aerial policing in the U.S. occurred in 1914 when police in Miami used a Curtiss F-type seaplane to capture an escaped prisoner. Usually, this small point is mentioned in aviation histories without much elaboration. But the use of the Curtiss seaplane to pursue and capture a human being is not just a causal historical footnote. In the years just before World War I, a tight-knit circle of wealthy men formed the America Transoceanic Company. Its aim was to develop planes for transatlantic flights, and their first product was the Curtiss seaplane. Glenn H. Curtis and Rodman Wanamaker, the heir to the Wanamaker department store fortune, teamed up to develop innovative aircraft that could land on water. And later on, they built many conventional airplanes as well. Curtis, like the Wright brothers, had been involved in, he made bicycles. And then he developed one of the first motorcycles. He was a speed freak. In this moment of early aviation, before many municipal airports had been built, seaplanes offered much improved mobility for socialites like Wanamaker, who needed to travel between homes in New York and Florida. Curtis was the engineer, and Wanamaker had the deep pockets necessary for the venture, but they were both mad for airplanes. And like so many forward-thinking people at the time, they pursued this with all of their available energies and resources. Men of the world, they wanted machines that could assist them in moving when and where they wanted, and they correctly assumed that others wanted these aerial modes of traveling as well. In addition to long-distance transportation between Long Island and Palm Beach, the Curtiss seaplanes were used for stunts, tours of property for tourists. Thus, hotels offered moonlight flights for honeymooners, and realtors scheduled tours of swamps destined to become the towns of Hialeah, Opelika, and Miami Springs, for instance. Flights started to run between Miami and Cuba and other islands carrying mail as well as passengers. The outbreak of war stymied the company's plans to sponsor the first nonstop Atlantic crossing. They achieved it just before Lindbergh. The plane stopped short of land, so they didn't get the record. They were involved in the same competition. But the advent of World War I only further demonstrated to a public of future investors and potential adherents the power and potential of what Peter Ade has termed aeromobility. What I want to stress in this storyline about early aviation is that as air power was in the process of proving itself in overseas aerial battles and reconnaissance, it was also emerging as a practice of U.S. domestic policing. Thus, the line between domestic and military patrol and policing was blurred from the start of aviation, raising the question of the ideological purpose of such a division. Thousands of Curtiss planes of all makes and models were purchased by the military for decades into World War II. In the meanwhile, during the First World War, Rodman Wanamaker was appointed as Special Deputy Police Commissioner in New York City, while reportedly buying more U.S. war bonds than any other citizen during the time period, overseeing the formation of the nation's first Metropolitan Police Department aviation section, a squad of planes armed with machine guns. In the late 1920s, Wanamaker's nephew, also confusingly for me, named Rodman Wanamaker, became the deputy police commissioner who put the first helicopters into police service in a U.S. city. What does this kind of social history tell us about an early 20th century military-industrial complex, and how does it inform our understanding of current air power projects like domestic drone policing? Certainly, there's a lot of money involved. As Augustus Mayhew writes, in 1907, Glenn Curtiss was a motorcycle manufacturer. 17 years later, he was a multimillionaire as the father of naval aviation and retired from the airplane business, moved to South Florida, and became a land developer. The airport he founded was later absorbed, Curtiss Field, was later absorbed into Miami International Airport. The era of the emergence of air power demonstrates not only how the political and economic aims of state and industry are drawn together through networks of people, that is, a number of key actors, but also how certain technologies operated to generate war, capital, and aesthetics. Therefore, it's absolutely no accident that New York City's police department became the first such force to form an aviation section, and it is not simply attributable to the fantastic wealth and influence of the two Rodman Wanamakers, although there's much more to say in that regard. Rather, the vanguard integration of planes and helicopters into metropolitan policing in New York City built on the general growing investment of the state on many scales, from large to small, in the apparatus of observation, as well as the particular and local operations of policing. The NYPD was the first real police department in the nation and established in 1845. Its home base has always been located in the lower part of Manhattan Island, very close to where the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center occurred. Closely modeled after the Metropolitan Police Service in London, which itself used a military-like organizational structure with rank and order, the NYPD developed a reputation for brutality in putting down the many riots and rebellions that punctuated life in that growing city throughout the 19th and early 20th century. They were experts in this. Militarized aeromobility has been part of the NYPD since the inception of aviation, bringing enhanced armed patrol and observation tactics to a formidable exemplar of metropolitan law and order. As one of the major port cities in the U.S., NYPD aviation sections have relied upon seaplanes, helicopters, and conventional airplanes since World War I. The Curtiss seaplanes were ideally suited for patrolling the islands, coastlines, and shipping lanes of the greater New York City metropolitan area. New York formed its volunteer air section early on in 1918 using surplus decommissioned Navy planes. I'm really interested in surplus. I'm just starting to work on this. It's all over my project, and I need to find out more about it. But the flow of military aviation surplus to domestic policing units has been built in from the beginning, from what I can tell. Many police departments depend on the trickle-down of former military planes and helicopters, and this is, of course, true for other kind of materiel. And many members of the departments are former or future soldiers. Such technology transfers in the era of aeromobility show that the line between military and civilian has always been an invested one, constructing apparently separate spheres that are, in fact, not always discernible as difference. Thus, it's with both military surplus and specially commissioned aircraft that the NYPD has been a leader in police aviation, and as the largest police force in the nation, it's relied heavily on its helicopter fleet for national security as well as metropolitan crime fighting. Helicopters are ideal for urban aerial surveillance. They don't need much space for takeoff, and they can maneuver easily in between buildings while maintaining different altitudes. And I don't have time to go into this, but of course in a lot of major metropolitan cities around the world, helicopters are becoming the transportation choice for the wealthy, and there's a lot of airspace being taken up just in general in order to avoid crowded and crime-ridden ground arenas. But in New York, the sky is still pretty much ruled by state and tour kinds of aircraft. Since 9/11, the NYPD has made good use of Homeland Security concerns and funding to build up a state-of-the-art fleet of high-tech helicopters. A 2006 New York Times article on the new Bell 412s that reads like a puff piece from the manufacturer reported that these helicopters are able, from, quote, over the pinnacles of Midtown, to reveal criminal or terrorist activity by boring down with the telephoto lens of a video camera that's also equipped with infrared sensors. As the reporters enthused, once confined to trailing stolen cars from 1,000 feet or throwing their powerful Klieg lights in nighttime demonstrations, the police department's aviation unit has quietly taken an aggressive role in law enforcement, transforming the age-old model of policing. These days, there's almost always an airborne cruiser over the city, providing bird's-eye advice to traffic officers, chasing teenagers out of cemeteries at night, or giving a lift to fire chiefs who want an overhead view of a raging blaze, end quote. Despite this small-town narrative of errant teenagers, traffic cops, and colleagues who need a lift, the context for the fleet of 7 state-of-the-art helicopters, as they say, outfitted with the latest mapping, tracking, and surveillance technology, is their aggressively militarized frontline role in thwarting terrorism. An AP story published online on MSNBC.com in May of 2008 celebrated the NYPD's purchase of state-of-the-art helicopters decked out with what they called an impressive arsenal of surveillance equipment intended to quote, protect the people on the ground from terrorist attacks. These helicopters, which were also made by Bell according to NYPD specifications, contain the technology to read license plates or, quote, scan pedestrians' faces from, as the copy puts it, high above the nation's largest metropolis. The NYPD aviation unit uses these stealth birds to patrol transportation and commercial sites that, quote, terrorists might find irresistible, with the advantage that flying in these $10 million copters, which have no police markings, these particular ones have no police markings, means that those on the ground have no idea they're being watched. As Christopher Wilson has argued, the invasive eye of the camera often has been associated with the vigilance of modern police investigations. That is, the power of seeing like a state as a police force produces knowledge. Wilson argues that aggressive paramilitary domestic policing was not only practiced in New York over the years, but came to be associated in the 1960s with Los Angeles. Deploying a Western-style preventive patrol, the LAPD evoked the national security apparatus in its fetishizing of intelligence gathering, massive shows of force, and technological domination. It's a quote from Christopher Wilson's text, Cop Knowledge. Cruising the city's grids by car and in the air, the LAPD developed scientifically managed patrol patterns, selectively targeting specific precincts by race and class as a matter of policy and training. The result was a disintegration of the old neighborhood beat with its more personalized forms of power in favor of paramilitary territorialism and a highly racialized practice of metropolitan policing, heavily reinforced by aerial observation, patrol, and pursuit. Such racialization from above, as Keith Feldman puts it, circulates from the criminal to the illegal alien to the security threat, generating post-colonial space, blurring the borders of contemporary war. This globalized homeland has existed across the modern period as imperial policing, but it can be argued that it has intensified in the current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as many other theaters of war. In this way, the history of the site of imperial viewing, so tied to the practices of air power, can, I think, be directly linked to the racialization of the war on terror. I'm referring to Keith Feldman's work here. Thus, the kind of paramilitary policing practiced for decades in New York and Los Angeles, often by aerial observation, patrol, and pursuit, makes ambiguous the metaphorical as well as the material borderline between war front and home front. The histories of military surplus, private and public partnerships to promote aerospace and security industries, and the territorialization of national airspace all add up to a generalized zone of policing as biopolitical subjects are produced via air power. And this brings me then to the very moment we're gathered here to address, the moment when the use of drones at home can be noticed and remarked upon. Contemporary journalism is full of justifiable concern about a perceived shift from civil policing to the full integration of the militarized concerns and practices of post-9/11 Homeland Security. Thus, the use of drones domestically is often embedded in the question of whether the so-called war on terror has militarized police forces, which had been somehow pristinely benign. A finely grained historical analysis of policies, regulations, and legal cases would probably support the argument that officially the separation of powers clearly insists that justice and defense remain apart as much as possible. But in practice, as we can see in the tension between these arenas, just in the history of air power in the NYPD or LAPD, the distinction is strained and not always possible to maintain. So I wonder what this historical forgetting of the colonial racial paramilitary past of our nation's police forces accomplishes. A good example of this social amnesia occurs in a recent article in The Atlantic in which Arthur Reiser and Joseph Hartman argue that there has been a major shift in the responsibility for fighting terrorism on home ground from law enforcement to the military. This change in policy, they argue, has led police forces to attempt to, as they put it, remedy their relative inadequacy by purchasing military equipment, adopting military-style training, and seeking to inculcate a soldier's mentality among their ranks. They go on to claim that the seemingly voluntary militarizing of domestic police forces has led to a blurring of the distinction between soldiers and police officers. And this is particularly true, the authors charge, when all this new military technology, weaponry, is used not just for the purpose of addressing terrorism, but also, as they put it, for everyday patrolling. And I couldn't resist just putting this slide together because in the hyperbole that you sometimes find in journalism for a variety of reasons, it was really sounding like, we had Mayberry versus RoboCop kind of situation. As they say, before 9/11, the usual heavy weaponry available to a small-town police officer consisted of a standard pump-action shotgun, perhaps a high-power rifle, and possibly a surplus M16, and we could talk about that since that's a notoriously ridiculous weapon, which would have been kept in the trunk of the supervising officer's vehicle. Now, police routinely walk the beat armed with assault rifles and garbed in black, full battle uniforms. When one of us, Arthur Reiser, returned from active duty in Iraq, he saw a police officer at the Minneapolis airport armed with an M4 carbine assault rifle, the very same rifle Arthur carried during his combat tour in Fallujah. In this account of weapon inflation and militarization, the reporters point to the increase in SWAT teams in small-town America, as well as the uptick in training by Special Operations Commandos. As they put it, special has quietly become routine. And their conclusion is that such blurring between the police as officers of the peace and war warriors will lead to an erosion of the presumption of innocence and other markers of democratic social justice, leading me to wonder where they've been. Not in New York or Los Angeles. The key is the differentiation of good guys from bad guys. As Reiser and Hartman write, soldiers are trained to identify people they encounter as belonging to one of two groups, the enemy and the non-enemy, and they often reach this decision while surrounded by a population that considers the soldier an occupying force. Once this identification is made, a soldier's mission is stark and simple: kill the enemy, try not to kill the non-enemy. In criminal justice at home, then, the assumption has been that it takes time and lengthy procedures to determine, legally if possible, whether or not a suspect is or is not an enemy of the state or community. In military contexts, there is no such time. The enemy must be identified rapidly and killed as equally rapidly as possible. In this scenario, the difference between battlefield and home front is significant. Two completely different modes of justice, one requiring instantaneous perception to as close as possible to identify enemy or non-enemy, and the other requiring a multivalent process of evidence collection and judgment that is far more prolonged. In theory. In practice, we know that unarmed populations are killed in battle zones, while at home, racial profiling and other practices lead to many instances of summary judgment and even execution by police or citizen proxies. We have recent cases come to mind. As the infotainment, cable, and internet pick up the story of domestic drones, we can expect more of this liberal hand-wringing over mistaken identities, crowded metropolitan airspace, and abridgment of constitutional rights. But I think that the history of air power at home that I've tried to sketch out briefly today can pose a different set of questions, such as, what does the state, through its police and military, claim that it needs to see? And how does it arrange populations or sense? And how does it arrange populations biopolitically via the imagery and information produced by air power? Air power's unique perspective has assisted the state in seeing populations in particular kinds of spatialized arrangements for decades, for over 100 years, especially through simplification and standardization of topographical and demographic information. But what do these claims obscure? And what forms of power operate through networks not definable exactly as the state? And how do these interests merge to produce what Vivienne Jabri calls the global matrix of war? For all of these reasons, drones at home certainly concern me, but they don't worry me more than drones in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Without making reductionist parallels, I hope, I'm reminded of that time at the end of World War I when a surfeit of military planes threatened to fill the junkyards as redundant waste and were instead transformed into civilian objects of use, either directly as surplus or indirectly through a powerful ideological apparatus that advocated for air power in all forms of modern life. This moment, the supersaturation of everyday life with the leftover products of these imperial wars, whether seaplanes from World War I, helicopters from the war in Indochina, GPS from the First Persian Gulf War, or drones from the catastrophe of the last decade plus a year, the war that as yet has no real proper name due to its shifting sights and aims, eluding all attempts to pin it down for history with a capital H. This moment seems to me to be integrated into the folds of all of these histories with a small h. Thank you. Shall we chat? Feel free to get rid of that.
thank you very much for these your presentations, and I want to start off a discussion, and we'll also start off something that we can also continue at lunch. And there are so many also ways to go, and I think I want to try to find some ways to bring together some of what got addressed. And I think when thinking about drone phenomena, what we saw really also this morning, and the need to really think about it on many fronts, ranging from the materiality of the platforms themselves, the evolution of sort of aerial as embedded in the evolution of aerial platforms of all sorts, as they're part of various kinds of policing and surveying practices, and then interfaces through which they're operated as embedded in practices of drone operation, and then the imagery that results from them, kind of visual artifacts, or how we might want to see it, and the ways in which this imagery is constructed, circulated in everyday life, moving from the private to the public arenas, and imageries that might involve point of views from drones or actually scenes of drone activity. And all of these really also kind of moving across the lines between the domestic and the global, between the civilian and the military, even between, as you said, Karen, between military activity and police activity. And so there's lots to be talked about there, but the one thing that I think that emerged that I might like to focus on, just at least to get start, is affect. This got brought up in different ways by everyone, and it's something also connects to all of us because of we feel things when we see this imagery, and as Lisa really started off talking about, affect is something really thinking it's also something quite difficult to think about and very murky and slippery, and it's almost a kind of excess in an image, and it kind of resists containment and also articulation, and it's something that's sort of embedded in the images themselves, but also in infrastructures through which they're circulated, as Lisa really talked about, something that's sort of integrated into the systems through which images are constituted and propagated, and then affect in also in domestic of these aerial platforms that you illustrated, Karen, too, and thinking also about, I think that often they're talked about in terms of policing control, but also there's a certain kind of, I think when you really started off, I saw also the pleasures of mastery, or they want to think of control, but also the kind of achievements through the kind of harnessing of space and speed. And then Peter also in that how the emotional challenges, so you just think about how affect plays out in the cockpit, and how it might slip into these embodied experiences. You can think about it as very stressful, and all of these sort of things that affect actually, the interesting about it is how it slides into and constitutes embodied experiences of all sorts. But the challenges of the shifting temporalities you outlined, and the stressful situations of navigating the different pressures of the arenas between the job and between the home. So there's a lot to really think about there, and so maybe that's enough. It's a big chunk enough. So yes.
Should I start? Okay. So I should preface it with another sort of claim, which is a lot of what I'm sort of strategically working on is trying to avoid a situation where we automate the lethal decision-making process completely and take humans out of the loop. So I'm working on international arms control to try to prohibit fully autonomous lethal systems. So in a sense, then, part of my mission is to justify keeping the human there. And why do we need them? And this notion of the ethical governor has been discussed a bit. We saw a portion of the video yesterday. And this idea that we could replace ethics with an automated process. And I think part of what makes that impossible or undesirable is the emotional relationship that people have with other people, and this affect and sympathy and empathy, really. And if we, I don't know how that gets reconstructed in an automated system. I don't think that's possible. And it's also, however, this sort of source of stress, post-traumatic stress. So wouldn't it be better if all of our soldiers came home without post-traumatic stress? So wouldn't it then be better to remove the emotionality of war and the stress that it causes? And then you have this kind of the counter view, I think, which I believe it was Robert E. Lee who said, you know, war is so horrible lest we love it too much, right? So that if we didn't have this kind of horror, then we would use lethal force far more frequently because we would be even more distanced and detached from its effects. So in a sense, then, we're really asking the pilots and the warriors to take on this emotional stress for everybody else, and that's sort of part of their duty as this kind of class of warriors, is to experience the suffering that our society demands them to conduct. And that's kind of paradoxical, right? Because we would want to say, like, why should they have to do that? Their job's already so hard, or you know, why should they have to be exposed to other kinds of threats? And I think from an ethical perspective, like, removing them from the battlefield, removing them from the immediate threat has implications for their willingness to use force and their kind of relationship to these other things. To an extent, the technology can re-articulate that, can bring that back, how do you take that sort of emotional information of that experience you have with and translate that 7,000 miles, right? And so part of that's visual, but then it's all this stuff about context and psychology, and I think it's enormously complicated and something we've never thought about. And it's only at that moment where you splitting agency, which used to be so well, you know, encapsulated in a single body, and now you're putting it in these two different locations, so the thoughts and the actions are divided. And I think I mean, I don't have the right answer, but I find that very interesting.
I really appreciated both of your talks, and I think, you know, Peter, this investigation of the labor practices of surveillance is so essential, and I was glad that you're complicating the video game argument too, and you do it in a different way than another scholar who's a geographer named Derek Gregory. Maybe I know you've read his work, but it's a point to make in relation to the issue of affect, because Gregory argues that the war is not 7,000 miles away in the mind of the pilot. It's 18 inches, and I just think it's another kind of, you know, critical argument to add to yours, to continue to complicate this notion that it's just a video game war. And he also talks about the kind of intimacy of drone warfare, the intimate relationships that get formed between pilots and troops on the ground, and that it's all about a kind of, you know, brotherly care for the people in the field. So that's another. I mean, not that wasn't the issue of affect that I was talking about, but I think it's an important. I encourage people to read Derek Gregory's work on this too.
One of the things that interests me so much about thinking about views from the air and air power is the deep embrace our culture has with the idea that distance is a form of alienation, when in fact distance is a method of achieving intimacy and it's about proximity by degree, maybe you could say, and that people negotiate intimacy and proximity via various scales of distance. That sounds a little philosophical, but I think the archive supports this as opposed to this received notion that we have that distance basically creates murderers out of pilots. I've been collecting as many examples and accounts as I can from World War II in particular, where this became like a real truism. Especially pilots who participated in firebombing of Tokyo and of Dresden and other places were horrified, haunted, destroyed by these experiences, and have published accounts, and there are also unpublished records of this kind. And there are others, of course, who were disturbed by it, but there are plenty who were. There are accounts from the people who were involved in the dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that they, too, if not immediately later on, registered some form of emotional disturbance and concern. But I think that it's also, these are more spectacular examples, but we tend to believe that the higher up you get, the more abstract the ground appears, and the more removed we are emotionally. And I think that one of the exciting things I found in looking at the accounts of early balloonists was the tremendous joy. They were mostly scientists, and they were chemists for the most part, and they took up all kinds of, when they went up in balloons, they took flasks, all kinds of things, scales, all sorts of things to measure things, and they were busy taking notes. But their notes got overtaken by their accounts of their joy in the views that they saw from the air. And it was really great for me to get into that material, because here I was thinking about, okay, how did these views get militarized, and how did this become a sort of a death-dealing activity? And I found myself immersed in accounts of buoyancy and joy. So I had to really rethink that, and it made me go back and look at other signs of affective engagement with flight and views from above with a more complicated and open attitude. So I just wanted to kind of put that in. I think that many people, myself included, love to see things from above. It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle. It's relaxing. It's meditative. For some of it's our job, and it requires more focused kinds of perception. But it's way more. Sorry, this is long-winded, but I really think we need to sort of really try and resist immediately falling into the common sense notion that distance is immediately a form of emotional alienation. The distance view.
Great. I think just one more thing. We'll open up to everyone. But there's one thing that actually, Lisa, you had said that when you talked about sound, and often we're used to seeing images relatively silent when we access them for the most part. I mean, well, I think in terms of aerial imagery for the most part, but also a lot of news imagery, of course, too. But you were speaking specifically about aerial imagery, right? And I wonder if we could talk about sound a little bit, because sometimes that kind of does get dropped off in the focus on the visual. And so could you talk about why you consider sound so crucial?
I think it's especially important in some of these UAV loops that are available in the video portals online, because you can hear the interpretive process at work. You can hear the pilots and those participating in the communication and intelligence network assessing the information, trying to make sense of it, and participating in a collective sense-making process that is completely unavailable to us and unintelligible to us if we're just looking at the visual field. And I think that also can relate to what Peter's trying to get at too, and trying to think about drone, the pilot subjectivity, and realizing the complexities that are embedded in this process of sorting through immense volumes of data in a very quick time period. So I think the sonic there is I mean, it's of great interest to me, and I intend to deal with it in the longer version of this paper.
Yeah, just to follow on, there was a study, a friendly fire incident that occurred in Afghanistan where a predator fired on a Marine and a Navy medic who was helping him. And it was a mistaken identity case, but there was a 380-page report that the Marines produced studying its effects, and it was still classified, but it was leaked to a journalist in the LA Times who reported on it in December. And it was very clear from that analysis, when they sort of figured it all out after the fact, that there were imager analysts in Indiana who had recognized that they were friendly. They were firing their weapons, but they said the muzzle flashes were pointed away from this other group of Marines who were being shot at by a different group of Taliban. So they were trying to identify who these two people were. And these analysts said, oh, they look friendly. They're firing away from the other friendlies. But it was in a chat screen that was not being watched. And the mission coordinator, who was this third person in the room, wasn't a trainee and wasn't prepared to analyze that data very well. And so it was really this case that was clearly laid out where the communications that are happening in multiple channels, so there's audio, but there's also text, and there's different kinds of software, so that they didn't have the right kind of software in this cockpit to get the chat on the right screen, and that's why two people had to die, right? So, and these things happen all the time in all sorts of different ways, and there's thousands of these stories kind of out there. And I mean, sound is huge. That one thing they figured out with the drone cockpits was getting the engine noise and wind noise from the Predator to play in the cockpit is very helpful for noting when it's going to stall and different kinds of flight conditions and things like that as well. So it's this reconstruction of embodiment within the cockpit that's kind of remote. So visuality is one element.
Sounds are actually made available to them intentionally.
So they can assess the operational status.
Yeah, so it's more multimodal, immersive.
I would just recommend Jenny Terry's multimedia piece, Killer Entertainments. It's a web-based essay, and it's a triptych, basically. She found video clips from both Iraq and Afghanistan, and you can play it with or without sound. You can do all kinds of variations with the site, and experiencing the piece without sound is very different than experiencing it with sound. And when you have all three pieces going simultaneously with their sound, it's another experience entirely. So I just thought I would mention that. It's a great little laboratory for those of us interested in the relationship between vision, sound, and the immersive experience of combat representation. It's a good example. It's called Killer Entertainments.
Does anyone like to have a question or comment? Yes.
Yeah, the first time that I presented this, it was for a symposium called Networks of Power, and so I was really foregrounding the trope of the network in the analysis. But at the same time, I feel like there's a need to kind of get more material and specific about the way that networking is not just a horizontal process, and to think about the kind of hierarchization and stratification of the network in very literal terms. That and all of us, I think, showed these slides where you see a terrestrial layer, an aerial layer, an orbital layer, and even subterranean and suboceanic layers. So to think about how networks, how we can begin to conceptualize networks not just as these horizontal systems of information transfer and political organization, but also vertical fields. That's something I'm interested in kind of pushing further in this analysis and in my book project. So.
Yeah, so I tend to think of it in terms of socio-technical networks. So I think there's this intersection of social networks and technological networks. And then working in STS, I'm also in the frame of actor network theory, right? So these networks are being constructed and deconstructed, and some of them are stable and some of them are unstable, and they're also unfolding and emerging and growing in time. So they have this historical temporality to them. And I think the drone is very interesting. So one thing I forgot to mention in my main talk was at the same time that they introduced the pilot wings for pilots in the Air Force of UAVs, they also officially renamed UAVs to RPAs, which are remote piloted aircraft. And that was motivated also by a media concern that the media had been reporting all these drone strikes and unmanned aerial vehicles. And the sense was that the drones were getting all the credit, right? There's actually all these personnel who are working really hard, and they're not getting the credit for, taking out all these bad guys. And this idea that their work doesn't count and they're being discredited, and that we're going to bring the pilots back and respect what they do. But there are all these layers of, what work gets respected and what work doesn't get respected, and right, it's more accurate. And the sense then that, we fixate on the drone, right? But the drone is the small little, protuberance of this massive network, right? And we sort of fixate on that, and we ignore everything else all too easily, right? And in order for that drone to do what it does, there has to be this massive apparatus, and it has many layers and all sorts of complexity to it, and many points at which we can question it and criticize it. But if we just sort of fixate on this endpoint, we kind of miss the bigger picture. So I think that's what's motivating a lot of what I'm doing.
I would just say briefly that I've been using actor network theory and some of the network theorists like Gallagher and others to try to retrain myself, because I came through a particular kind of cultural studies that was working around ideas of representation and discourse analysis in a particular historical moment, and it's been really helpful for me to use these ideas to critique some kinds of representation, theories of representation. So I feel like I'm in the midst of a major kind of transformation in the methodology of the work that I do. I think often technologies that one is drawn to look at become metaphorically symptomatic of that.
I just want to say one more thing that I kind of alluded to at the end of my talk, but in terms of networks, I think it's important to think about the shift from the kind of networks that Trevor Paglen has discussed in his work on the rendition flights. His book Tortured Taxi that he co-authored with, I can't remember the other guy's name, Thompson or Tomlinson, but a shift in paradigms from rendition flights where we have a whole network of torture sites around the world to a paradigm of drone warfare and targeted killing that is a kind of response to the complexities and legal challenges and problems with torture. So I think drone warfare has a way of resolving or trying to make more efficient what's been happening with Guantanamo. It eliminates the apprehension of an enemy combatant and instead uses a drone to just simply do away with the person. So there's a way we see a kind of acceleration of the structures in the kind of rendition flight and torture scenario. And drone warfare is really making that much more efficient, I think.
Arthur? Yes.
Just picking up the last comment that Lisa's made, it's a really good comment. Would you think that it's possible to analyze drones as the quintessential site of liberal reconception of warfare? I'm thinking of rendition flights and torture and those kinds of your conservative regime previously. The liberal regime, I thought you were presenting as thinking back to the speech from the other Bill Price, was called the speech of the just war, which he went to the seminar not to talk about the impact
That's a really interesting comment. Yeah, I don't know if I could put it any more eloquently or say anything to add to it.
If I could riff off of that one first, the distinction between liberal and Democrat warfighting and conservative warfighting would seem to be less on the superficial morals because the conservatives claim very, very similar sounding justifications, but the difference appears to be very, very macroscopic. In the Balkans, in Libya, in all these other places, the democratic approach to fighting war, and by the way, when Afghanistan phase one, where Bush had to go into Afghanistan very, very quickly at Osama's invitation, very clear invitation, that also was fought using Clintonian and democratic doctrines of war, and that was surgical, using special forces and very, very fine scale targeting of air power. Whereas both Bushes, Afghanistan II, Iraq, and the first Iraq war back in 1992, used massive force. And it would appear to me that this is one of the reasons why we have this acceleration of drones. It's because it fits into democratic, but Democratic parties' leanings towards military doctrine. Do you have any comments on that?
I think, I question the rhetorics of precision and surgical strikes. I'm reticent to try to embrace a democratic form of warfare.
I can understand that you would criticize both.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that insofar as the macroscopic style of
Right.
reaching out to kill, both parties have this distinctly different macroscopic styles. I'm not asking you to pick one or the other. What are you voting for? You can criticize both.
It may be that I think that another factor to consider. These are good points. Another factor to consider might be the various moments when one arm or branch holds sway over another. So, if the CIA has a little more clout at a particular moment, we're going to see more use of certain kinds of intelligence gathering and then operations that are based on that sort of activity that would perhaps be more surgical or involve special ops. And at other moments when the other branches of the military, whether it's naval or air, et cetera, feel that it's their venue or it's their kind of operation and they're able to convince the powers that be of that, we see more widespread shows of force. Different conflicts actually sometimes have different stages. Think about in the Persian Gulf Wars, there's usually a softening up with an air war, and then they send ground forces in after they've kind of eliminated a lot of the hard sources of resistance of defense that the ground forces would meet. So different conflicts have different kinds of characters or personalities, if you will, depending on the terrain, the politics, and who's currently really in power in the Department of Defense and has the ear of the White House. So I think there are kind of micro stories along those lines that factor into some of these things as well as the actual political parties. There are people who are more conservative and more moderate in both parties. So it's interesting to map all of these layers and registers, I think.
Yeah, I would just totally second that. I don't know that I could distinguish any partisan difference between styles of war. There's certainly different rhetoric about the justifications for those wars, but I think a lot more of the strategic and material organization of war depends a lot more on whichever generals are in power. I mean, whether it's McChrystal or Petraeus or what those strategies are makes a lot more difference about how some of these things are unfolding. And those politics are rapidly developing and changing from month to month and week to week. But I think, to go back to the original liberal question, I think the notion of liberal there was really about the liberal subject, and this idea that, you know, people have rights, and that to the extent that war can be justifiable, it has to exist within a framework that has an international respect for rights. And in that regard, yeah, you have to have this kind of evil. There has to be the bad guy in order to justify the war. And what we've seen, I think, in the whole post-9/11 era is this hybridization of discussions of criminality and military warfare language, right? So bad guys aren't just criminal bad guys. It's a war on terror, but terrorists don't have a state. And so war is about state-on-state conflict, or at least trying to take over a state at some level. And so, and that's the framework in which, like, Geneva Conventions and most of the laws of war have been articulated. And so these questions about Guantanamo and, you know, unlawful combatant status and targeted killings fall into these kind of cracks because they're constantly switching frames between criminality and warfare. And I mean, we had this very nice visual display of how the militarization of police is also kind of blurring this distinction as we take now more and more of the criteria of warfare and we're applying them within policing domestically.
We have time for one more. Arthur first, and then Ricardo, and then we'll break for lunch. Yep.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's this multitasking, this divided subject, this kind of multiple personality kind of, which we've all sort of have different roles in different aspects of our lives, but that they've become so much more intense and overlapping, and there's so many more demands on our attention at any given moment, and our ability to sort of manage that is itself productive of stress, and that's, I mean, part of the whole post-human condition that we find ourselves in the 21st century.
Ricardo?